Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Erin King. I'm with Amplify. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to give it a few minutes to let everybody hop on. As you can tell, we have a wonderful guest with us today, Ms. Natalie Wexler. So we're really excited to have her here. While we're waiting, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, just first name and where you're from is wonderful. I'll start. I'm Erin, as I mentioned, and I'm from Austin, Texas. Where we still have a little bit of daylight, but I can feel the winter hours are creeping in. So I'm not sure about everybody else out there. And as just a housekeeping note, we're going to be recording today's webinar, and you will get an email tomorrow that has a link to this recording. And in addition to that, because you're here live watching today, you're going to get a special link in your email that will take you to a website where you can pick a free copy of one of Natalie's books. So we're offering The Knowledge Gap, which she's going to talk about today, and also another book, The Writing Revolution. So you'll be able to pick which title you would like to receive. All right, I think we are about to get started, and we'll have some folks joining us here in a few minutes. As I said, my name is Erin with Amplify. We're so excited to have you here today. We've been doing a Science of Reading webinar for my very favorite Western states. And Natalie is so gracious to give us some of her time today to talk about the knowledge gap. And specifically, she's going to be looking at ways that, what is it and what are some ways that we in the classroom and in schools and districts can narrow that gap. So I'm going to get out of the way so she can start presenting. But as we go, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And toward the end of the session, Natalie will be happy to answer those questions. All right, take it away, Natalie.
Thank you, Erin. And I'm delighted to be here to talk a bit about the knowledge gap, what it is and how to narrow it. I'll also be touching on the writing revolution briefly. But I thought I'd start by just talking about how and why I came to write this book, The Knowledge Gap. And it started, I'd say, about maybe 7 or so years ago now. I had been writing about education in Washington, D.C., where I live, and I've been sort of active in the education reform movement here. And I really wanted to figure out why this gap that's commonly called the achievement gap, the gap in test scores between kids at the upper and lower ends of the socioeconomic spectrum, essentially, why that gap was so large and so difficult to narrow. And when I started, I thought, like many others who've looked at this problem, that the real problem, and now that my slides are not advancing, I'm going to have to stop share and get back into this. Sorry. Sometimes this happens. Try it this way. Okay. Just give me a second here. I think maybe what I need to do is let me try this one more time.
No worries. I know, isn't it crazy? We were on and you were flipping through them like they were just fine. It just decided to give you a little headache.
Yeah. Let's see. Oops. I gotta move this bar. I can't. Okay. Let me try this one more time.
There you go. That's perfect.
Yes. Okay. So I thought, and now I have to get rid of this thing. Okay. I thought the problem was, oh, now it's not doing it again. Okay. Let me try this. If I have to just do it without, not in presentation mode, that's what I'll do. But let me see if I can. Okay, so I thought the problem was high school. That seemed to be where the students were the most disengaged. That gap was largest, and overall achievement was just the worst. But what I discovered, or what was explained to me eventually, that what I thought was the bright spot in education, elementary school, was actually where the problems that become so apparent in high school really have their roots. So what do I mean by that? Well, mostly I am talking about Oh, no, it's happening again. Okay, I'm just gonna go through these without using the presentation mode because for some reason it's not working. So let's try this one more time. Okay, so what I'm really talking about mostly is reading and the way we approach reading in elementary school. And of course, there are two basic aspects, at least, to reading. There's decoding, which should be taught as a set of foundational skills, including phonemic awareness, phonics, and then there's fluency, which is the bridge to the other basic part, big part of reading, which is comprehension. And there are, as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of problems with the way we teach the decoding side of reading. And that's gotten a lot of attention. But you obviously need both decoding and comprehension if you're going to be a good reader. And I would argue that the problems with the way we've been teaching comprehension, reading comprehension, are even more widespread and better hidden than the problems with the way we teach decoding. So what is the standard approach to teaching reading comprehension? Basically, it's as a menu of skills and strategies. And there are lots of different ones. This is just one list that I found online. And you know, there are things like identify the main idea and details, make inferences, and there's often a skill of the week. So the first part of this approach is the teacher models the skill using a text that is usually chosen not so much for its content, but for how well it lends itself to demonstrating whatever the skill is, compare and contrast, whatever. And then the other part of this approach is that the students scatter to practice these skills on books that have been determined to be at their individual reading levels, which could be years below their grade level. But so you might be told you're a level L, which is the second grade level, but you're in 4th or 5th grade, but you're practicing those skills on books that are easy enough for you to read independently, essentially. And what the theory is that if you get, and again, these books are not organized by topic, it's really, you know, they're categorized by how long the sentences are or how long the words are. And the theory is that if you practice your skills on books that are easy for you to read and you master those skills, that will enable you to move up to where you should be if you're behind the grade, below grade level. And it'll also enable you to, you know, find the main idea of pretty much any text that's put in front of you, whether that's a text on a reading test at the end of the year, or it could be down the road in high school, a textbook. But if you're good at finding the main idea, you know, you can apply that skill to pretty much any text. So let's just test out that theory. I'm going to show you a paragraph taken from a newspaper, and I'm just going to ask you to find the main idea. And I'm sure you're all expert readers, so it shouldn't be that much of a problem. So here goes. Much depended on the two overnight batsmen, but this duo perished either side of lunch, the latter a little unfortunate to be adjudged leg before, and with Andrew Simons, too, being shown the dreaded finger off an inside edge, the inevitable beckoned, bar the pyrotechnics of Michael Clark and the 9th wicket. Now, if you're like me, you really don't know what this is trying to tell you. You can't forget finding the main idea, right? So what I neglected to tell you is that this paragraph is taken from a British newspaper, and it is describing a cricket match. And if you were a cricket fan and knew a lot about cricket, you'd have no trouble understanding this paragraph. But if, like me, you don't know the first thing about cricket, this is pretty impenetrable. You really don't know what this is trying to tell you. Now, this is something that cognitive scientists have known about for a long time. And back in the 1980s, there was a study that has come to be called the baseball study. A couple of researchers wanted to figure out what is more important in comprehension. Is it general skill or ability, or is it how much you know about the topic? And they chose the topic of baseball because they were doing this experiment on 7th and 8th graders, and they figured there are a lot of kids out there who are not generally good readers, but they do know a lot about baseball. So they gave them all a passage to read describing a baseball game. And first they divided them into 4 groups, depending on how well they scored on a standardized reading test and how much they knew about baseball. Then they gave them this passage describing a baseball game and tested their comprehension of that passage. And what they found was that what really made the difference was not general skill, it was knowledge of the topic. So those middle 2 bars on that graph, the one on the left, the taller one, those are the supposedly poor readers, low reading ability, who knew a lot about baseball. And the shorter bar to the right, those are the supposedly good readers who didn't know much about baseball. And as you can see, the poor readers did a lot better when they knew about the topic. Now, this suggests a couple of things. One is comprehension skills aren't skills like, they're not skills like riding a bike or playing tennis. They don't just get better with practice. It's going to depend to a large extent on what the topic is and how much the reader knows about it. And secondly, what goes along with that is there's really no such thing as a fixed reading level. Again, it's going to depend on the topic and how much the reader knows about it. Now that may be fairly obvious with a topic with, specialized knowledge like cricket or baseball. But I think what's less obvious is how much we rely on our background knowledge to make sense of things we read all the time, like articles in newspapers. So I'm going to show you a paragraph from another newspaper article, not about cricket this time. And this time I'm just going to ask you to think about what knowledge you're drawing on to make sense of this paragraph. And this is a couple of years old, so it's a little dated. 2 appeals by the president in his private capacity and represented by private lawyers have reached the Supreme Court in the past week. 1, Trump v. Vance, is a formal appeal from a ruling by the Federal Appeals Court in New York upholding the validity of a grand jury subpoena obtained by the Manhattan District Attorney, Cyrus Vance, and served on the president's accountants for his personal and business tax records. So one thing that leaps out to me about this paragraph is that there's actually a lot of knowledge of the American legal system that's assumed, not deep knowledge, but some knowledge, like the word appeal or Supreme Court or grand jury, subpoena. And if you're missing that knowledge, then that paragraph is going to start looking more mystifying here. And, this is not written for people who've been to law school. It's written for general readers, and it's just assumed they're going to know something about those terms. There's also some other academic vocabulary here and some convoluted or, complex sentence structure. But, it's going to be very helpful if you at least have that knowledge of the law to help you understand what this paragraph is trying to tell you. And this has been found to be true of reading in general, that the more vocabulary you have, and it doesn't have to be necessarily vocabulary relating to the specific topic, but general academic knowledge and vocabulary, the more you have, the better your reading comprehension. So for example, there is a study showing there's a strong correlation between general academic knowledge, like in what part of the body does pneumonia occur, and general reading comprehension. And that suggests that to boost reading comprehension, kids need to acquire as much academic knowledge and vocabulary as possible. So, why is that? Why does having that knowledge, either knowledge of the topic or general academic knowledge and vocabulary, why does it help us with comprehension? What's going on in the mind? Well, this is a diagram of not places in the brain, but just processes in the mind that helps explain that. So that first box, sensory memory, that's really not important. Just means if you don't pay attention to something, you're not going to remember it. Pretty obvious. But that middle box, working memory, that's really important. So working memory is the aspect of our consciousness where we're taking in new information and we're trying to make sense of it. And the important things to know about working memory is that it can easily get overloaded. It can only hold about 4 or 5 items for maybe 20 seconds or so. And so if we're juggling too much in working memory, we don't have the cognitive capacity there to understand what we're trying to take in or to retain that information. And that load, that burden that's placed on working memory is called cognitive load. Now, different people have different working memory capacities, but there's really no reliable way to expand anybody's working memory. There is, however, a way around it, and that's that last box, long-term memory, which is potentially infinite. If you can just withdraw items from long-term memory that you have stored there, you don't have to juggle them in working memory. So, for example, if you're reading about baseball and you know what a double play is, or you're reading about the law and you know what an appeal is, you don't have to try to figure that out. You don't have to look it up, which places a burden on working memory. You can just plug that in and you have more capacity for comprehension. The trick is, first you have to get information from working memory to long-term memory. That's that word transfer at the top. And the best way to do that is by attaching some kind of meaning to the information, like explaining it to someone else. And then you have to be able to retrieve that information from long-term memory when you need it in working memory. And the best way to make sure that you can do that is to practice retrieving it, maybe through quizzes, or again, through explaining it, talking about it, writing about it. So that's the basic idea of why having prior knowledge helps with comprehension. It opens up more space in working memory for understanding. So what does all this have to do with testing? Well, the passages on reading tests, like all written text, don't explain every term that is used. If writers did that, nobody would want to read their writing. It would be really tedious. And the passages on reading tests don't have anything to do with what kids may have learned in school. In fact, they're designed not to have anything to do with that, because the idea is, well, we're not testing their knowledge. We're testing their reading comprehension, just their general ability here. But if you don't have enough background knowledge, if you don't have enough information stored in long-term memory to enable you to understand the passage on the test, you never get a chance to demonstrate your skill at finding the main idea or making inferences or whatever. So to show you what that looks like in practice, I'm just going to show you a paragraph now that was taken from a standardized reading comprehension test that was given to third graders. In one of the most remote places in the world, the Canadian Arctic, a people have survived over 1,000 years. They are the Inuit. For the Inuit, the Arctic is a place teeming with life. Depending on how far north they live, the Inuit find everything from caribou herds and polar bears to beluga whales. Now, to us as educated adults, that may look pretty straightforward, but for a lot of third graders, there are terms here that they will not understand, that they won't be familiar with. And if you're not familiar with those terms, this paragraph might look like this. And if you're missing that much information, this becomes as mystifying as that paragraph about cricket was if you don't know anything about cricket. Now, of course, some third graders will know these terms, or most of them, and they tend to be the third graders who've been able to acquire that information outside of school, probably because they have more educated parents and they've heard these terms, or they've been to museums or whatever. But for the other third graders, they rely on school for this kind of knowledge and vocabulary. And unfortunately, in our current system, those third graders are the least likely to get that information at school. Why is that? Well, we have had for a while now a narrowing curriculum. As reading and math tests have become so important, these other subjects, social studies, the arts, science, have been marginalized or even eliminated from the elementary curriculum. And that's especially true in schools where test scores are low. Because the theory is, well, if we want to get those reading scores up, or the reading and math scores, then we need to spend more time on reading and math. And with reading, a lot of that time is spent practicing those supposed comprehension skills that seem to be evaluated by reading tests. But the problem is that those subjects that have been eliminated, social studies, science, the arts, are the most likely to build the kind of academic knowledge and vocabulary that helps students do well on reading tests, that give them that knowledge. And not just on reading tests, but in high school and beyond. So what does this I mentioned high school. What does this have to do with high school? Sorry, there we go. Well, having academic knowledge or prior knowledge of the topic doesn't just help you with comprehension. It also, as I mentioned, helps you absorb and retain new information. It's been said that having knowledge is like Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. And so the kids who start out with more knowledge and with academic knowledge and vocabulary, first of all, they get to read more complex books in our leveled reading system, but they are also more likely to be able to absorb and retain new vocabulary, new information from those books, because they have more of that other half of the Velcro. And that in turn enables them to read yet more complex text. And so it can be a kind of virtuous cycle for those kids. But for the kids who start out with less of that other half of the Velcro, less academic knowledge and vocabulary, first of all, they're reading simpler books that have less information, but even the information that's in those books, they're less likely to be able to absorb and retain that because they don't have that other half of the Velcro or as much of it. And so it's been said that this has been called, this divergence has been called the Matthew effect in reading, which is a reference to the part of the Gospel of Matthew that says it's basically the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And so this gap between the quote unquote good readers and the quote unquote poor readers gets larger with every passing year and more difficult to narrow, which is why it's so important to start at kindergarten, if not before, building that academic knowledge and vocabulary for all kids, because by the time they get to high school, it's going to be tough. And one problem here is it can look like skills and strategies that approach is working at lower grade levels, but the approach can backfire when students reach upper grades. It can look like it's working basically because the books and the texts at lower grade levels don't assume that much academic knowledge and vocabulary. So it can look like students are getting better at finding the main idea. But then when they get to upper grades and more knowledge and vocabulary is assumed and they don't have it, they hit a wall. And there's another related gap that becomes very apparent when kids get to high school, which is the gap between what we assume high school students know and what many do know. It's not uncommon for students to get to high school without ever having had systematic exposure to history, geography, science, or really anything but reading and math, especially if they're coming from elementary and middle schools where test scores are low. And yet we give them textbooks like this in world history and expect them to read and understand them. And kids may not know really basic things like the difference between a country and a continent, or a city and a state, or where the United States is on a map of the world, or really anything, any factual information about history. They may not really have a concept of history. So if you're missing that much background knowledge, this is going to be very frustrating to try to understand a book like this for you and for your teacher. And when I stumbled across this problem, the lack of content in the elementary school curriculum and all of these ramifications, I was very concerned. There were a few people who were aware of this and concerned about it, but it hadn't gotten into the general conversation about education. And I thought, well, maybe if somebody writes a book that takes a more sort of narrative, engaging approach, maybe it will get into that conversation. And so that's the book that I've tried to write, The Knowledge Gap. And as concerned as I was about this issue when I was researching and writing the book, I'm even more concerned now, because with remote and hybrid learning, the situation is more urgent than ever. Some kids, when they're home, are effortlessly picking up a lot of academic knowledge and vocabulary, and others are not even getting the exposure that they would have gotten at school. And so that gap has been widening every day. But I didn't write the book just to describe the problem. I also wanted to talk about where can we go from here? What can we do about this? And the good news is that there is a lot that schools and individual teachers can do to help narrow this knowledge gap. So what can individual teachers do? A number of things. One is to organize read alouds by topic, not skill. So spend a couple of weeks, maybe more, on a topic like sea mammals, and read a series of books about that topic, because kids need to have repeated exposure to the same vocabulary and concepts in order to get that lodged in long-term memory. Second, ask questions that put content in the foreground. So rather than saying, okay, we're making inferences this week, so can somebody make an inference? Ask a question about the content that requires students to make an inference. That's what will work better. And then organize classroom libraries, not just by reading level, but also by topic and by specific topics. So not just animals or plants, but sea mammals, if that's what you've been reading and talking about. And have the books, a basket of books at different levels of difficulty about sea mammals. Because remember the baseball study, which is, by the way, not just one study, but there are plenty of other studies that come to the same conclusion about importance of knowledge. If kids have knowledge of the topic, you may be surprised at the level they'll be able to read at. And going along with that is to be skeptical about reading levels. You know, if a kid wants to try something that looks too difficult and has some knowledge of the topic, let the kid try. And then spend lots of time on meaty social studies and science topics, because remember, they're going to have the most potential to build the kind of knowledge and vocabulary kids need to fuel their reading comprehension. But there's a limit to what any individual teacher is going to be able to do, because building knowledge is a gradual, cumulative process that extends not just across 1 year, but across grade levels. And teachers can't control what happens at other grade levels. So somebody at a higher level is going to need to step in for this gap to really be narrowed. So what can administrators and policymakers do? Well, the first and crucial step is to adopt a content-focused elementary literacy curriculum that goes deeply into topics in social studies, science, and the arts. And there are a number of curricula, elementary literacy curricula out there now that do that. They all cover different bodies of knowledge in different ways, but they all have a couple of important things in common. One is that they're organized by topic, not by skill of the week, and they spend at least 2 or 3 weeks on a topic. And they also give all students in a classroom access to complex grade level text, perhaps through teachers reading aloud. That's really important for reasons I'm going to discuss in a moment. So we have to recognize that literacy is about much more than reading. We've been really kind of narrowly focused on reading and really expecting kids to build their own knowledge through their reading. But really, literacy is a network of things, including listening, oral language, reading, and writing. Listening is important for a couple of reasons. This graph shows you, this has been a study that was done, finding that on average, a kid's listening comprehension exceeds their reading comprehension through about age 13. That means they can take in more complex information vocabulary through listening than through their own reading. So that's going to be the most effective way to build their knowledge when they're, not just when they're still learning to decode, but for a while. And it's also going to be a good way to expose them, to familiarize them to the more complex syntax of written language and that academic vocabulary. And then listening's not going to be enough. There's also oral language, talking about the concepts you've just heard about, using the vocabulary in class discussion that you've just heard. That's going to help cement that in long-term memory. And that's going to set you up to do reading at a more advanced level than you might otherwise be able to, and also writing. Listening and oral language, listening and speaking are easier than reading and writing. They impose less of a burden on working memory. So there's what's going to fuel the reading and writing that's harder. And a good curriculum is going to focus, first of all, focus on content, and secondly, connect all of these aspects of literacy with reading. So I'd just like to briefly give you a glimpse into a couple of classrooms that I followed through a school year, early elementary classrooms, first grade and second grade. One using the standard skills-focused approach to comprehension, and the other using one of these newer content-focused curricula. I don't have video, but I can show you posters. So the one on the left is a typical poster from this skills-focused classroom. All of the posters were on comprehension skills, and it was very hard for the teacher to get a discussion going in this classroom. These first graders just did not have much to say about sequence of events or whatever. This second poster on the right is from, happens to be from Core Knowledge Language Arts, which is the oldest of these knowledge building curricula, from the unit on Greek myths. And these kids had amazing discussions. They loved Greek myths, but they also talked about things like the War of 1812 and just very thoughtful discussions, and they often didn't want to stop. But I'd like to point out a couple of things about this poster in particular. One is the vocabulary that's being taught here, the words of the day: desperately, plummeted, foresight, pretty sophisticated vocabulary words for any group of second graders. But these second graders, most of them came from non-English speaking families. And yet they were using words like these actually in their conversation because they were encountering them in an engaging context. They were using them in class discussion and sometimes in writing. And these words will stand them in good stead in years to come. Second, it could look from this poster like the teacher is teaching skills. There's a question, predict, what is Daedalus's plan? And there are these boxes that say cause and effect. But she wasn't trying to teach the skill of making predictions or the skill of determining cause and effect. She was bringing those things in as a way of getting kids to think deeply about the content. And that's what works. So I'd just like to briefly talk about writing for a minute. Writing can be an incredibly powerful lever for building knowledge and literacy generally. But we have made a couple of mistakes. First of all, we've underestimated how hard it is. It's much harder than reading, and we've kind of expected kids to just pick it up. And secondly, we've tried to teach it in isolation from content. So maybe having kids write, narratives about their personal experience or a separate writing curriculum on different topics. But if we want to use it to build knowledge, we should be building the knowledge we want kids to acquire. So what we need to do, first of all, is begin at the sentence level, because that'll modulate that heavy cognitive load, make it easier. And secondly, embed writing activities in the content of the core curriculum. And there's only one approach I know of that observes both of those principles, and that is the Writing Revolution, which is both the title of a book and the name of an organization that offers training in the method. So I don't have time to go into that further, but I encourage you to look into it if it piques your curiosity. I do want to just quickly mention that there is growing evidence that building kids' knowledge boosts reading comprehension. We've known for a long time that having knowledge helps with reading comprehension, but it's been harder to show that building knowledge boosts reading comprehension. But we do now have a couple of studies of kindergartners showing that, and also this meta-analysis of 35 studies of the elementary grades showing the same thing, that it really can boost comprehension even on standardized tests that aren't tied to the knowledge in the specific curriculum. So curriculum is crucial. It's the place to start, but it's probably going to be enough just adopting a content-rich curriculum, because it's going to be very different from what most teachers are used to. And there may be some obstacles to getting that curriculum implemented effectively. One possible obstacle here is testing, because those tests are not tied to any particular body of knowledge. There are a couple of problems. One is teachers may look at the tests and it looks like they're testing skills. There's nothing on the test about sedimentary rock or whatever. So teachers may figure, well, I'm going to focus on skills because that's what my kids are going to need to do well on the test. Or even if they have focused on the knowledge, the content in the curriculum, it may not show up on their kids' test results because the passages on the test may be about completely different topics. Now, eventually, if kids are having their knowledge built through a coherent curriculum, eventually they will have enough general academic knowledge and vocabulary to handle any grade level text that's thrown at them. But it could take a while. We just don't know in any given situation. So teachers need to understand, first of all, that these reading comprehension tests are, as one cognitive scientist has said, essentially knowledge tests in disguise. And they also need to know that it can take time to see results on those tests. But there are a few other obstacles that I'll just mention briefly, potential obstacles. One is intellectual. One category is intellectual obstacles of the head. And that's because everything I've been talking about is probably unfamiliar to most teachers. They haven't learned about the baseball study or whatever during their training, and they may have been told it's really not important to build knowledge if you want to boost comprehension. So they may be skeptical for that reason. And then there are emotional obstacles of the heart, which has a lot to do with the fact that if you've been teaching in a certain way for years in the sincere belief that you're helping kids, it's hard to hear the message that actually you may have been holding those kids back. And we, as human beings, we just raise defenses against hearing a message like that. And then lastly, there are behavioral obstacles of habit. Even if you want to do something differently in the classroom, teaching is such a complex activity that you may just forget in the moment. You may revert to longstanding habits. Now, none of these obstacles are insurmountable, but they may take essentially professional development. Coaching, not professional development as we have known it, though, not, one-day workshop on how to foster critical thinking in the abstract. That has been found not to work. But what has been found to work is professional development that is rooted in the specific content of the curriculum. So how do you foster critical thinking about, if you're teaching the myth of Daedalus and Icarus, about that? And then secondly, not just a one-day workshop, but professional development that is ongoing. Whoops, no, what happened? Let me get back to that. That is ongoing, cyclical, and collaborative. So teachers coming together, discussing a new idea, trying it out, coming back together, talking about how it went, and continuing that cycle. That's what's been found to work better. So I'd just like to end with an anecdote that I heard. I've heard many was researching and writing the book, but this one really stuck with me because I think it illustrates the fallacy of leveled reading and also the power of a knowledge building curriculum to change teachers' expectations. So this was a story I heard when I was out in Reno, Nevada. It was about a second grade teacher at a school that had recently adopted one of the knowledge building curricula. She was giving a test to one of her students to determine his individual reading level. And this was a kid who was struggling like crazy with reading. She saw in the testing kit that there was a text on the topic of westward expansion, hence this picture. Now that happened to be the topic that the class had just spent 2 or 3 weeks learning about. But the text was at a 4th grade level, and this was a struggling 2nd grade reader. But just out of curiosity, she handed the text to the boy, and to her surprise, he read it with 98% accuracy and 100% comprehension, meaning that it was actually too easy for him under the leveled reading formula. And I bet that that experience changed the teacher's concept of who that little boy was and what he was capable of. And it probably changed that little boy's concept of who he was as well, which is one reason I feel such a sense of urgency about this, because we're making kids feel like failures when it's not them, it's the system that has failed. So just to sum up, reading comprehension depends more on background knowledge and academic vocabulary than on comprehension skills. Students who start out with less academic knowledge fall farther behind every year if they're not acquiring it. To build knowledge, schools should adopt content-rich curriculum that begins in kindergarten and integrates listening, speaking, reading, and writing. To ensure the curriculum is implemented well, schools should provide ongoing support grounded in specific content. A knowledge-building approach can enable all children to reach their full potential and meet or exceed high expectations. So I can take some questions now if there are some, or if you think of some later or I don't have time to answer your question, you can always email me through my website, nataliewexler.com. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties, but I'll stop sharing and be happy to take questions. If Erin, are there questions that have come up?
Yes, we just got one from Eleanor. I am the only teacher in my grade level, fourth grade, at a very rural, low-income school. My pyramid is flipped. Do you have any recommendations for resources of readers that my students are able to read, but that are also grade appropriate content?
So when you say that your pyramid is flipped, I'm not sure what that means, but yeah, well, I mean, if your school is not going to be adopting a coherent curriculum, there are text sets. There are some that have been put together. There's an organization called Student Achievement Partners that has put together some example text sets organized around different topics and I think they are organized by grade level. So try that, Googling Student Achievement Partners text sets. That's one resource. There's also Newsela, which has, you can find groups of texts, text grouped around a certain topic. And I think they are sometimes at different levels of difficulty. I would be careful about that because you don't want some kids getting simpler content if you can avoid it. Certainly when they're reading on their own, they need some time to read. It means that most of my students are far below grade level. That's what pyramid being flipped means, with only a few students who are on grade level. So I would say, if you were using something like Newsela, I would read aloud a text on a topic that is more complex than students can handle on their own. But then maybe use that resource to provide them with texts on the same or a similar topic that is at a level of difficulty that they could probably handle on their own. And maybe they would do that, then they would read a slightly more advanced version so that they can move up, that ladder of text complexity, but they are in the process building the knowledge and vocabulary they need to move up. So those are a couple of ideas. There are other resources out there. There's National Geographic, there's a number of things, but those are the two that come to mind, looking at text sets and looking at Newsela. There are other resources that just aren't coming to mind at the moment, but if you email me, I might be able to send you some links.
Yeah, just to add to that, and I like how you are reminding us that read alouds can be so powerful. We tend to think of them as lower elementary resources, and I wonder if sometimes we forget that reading aloud still, even at the upper elementary grades, can still be really powerful in terms of, as you're saying, build that background knowledge and help them understand so that when they tackle a text on their own, they're a little bit more able to do that.
Yes, I can't emphasize that enough. It is, again, it's connected to that burden on working memory. Even if you can decode, if you're still not a really fluent reader, then your working memory is dealing with, how do I pronounce that word? Where do I put the emphasis in that sentence? And if an expert reader is doing that work for you, it's going to free up cognitive capacity to just take in the information and think about it. I see there's a question in the chat about, am I familiar with the National Geographic Reach curriculum? And I'm not, unfortunately. So I can't really comment on that.
Let me ask you, Natalie. So do you ever hear a concern from folks that there's just too much content to teach? How can I possibly cover it all in a way that kids will learn all of the different content? So we know that that's not possible, right? So how do you help people maybe overcome that hurdle in their mind and figure out how to what content to focus on?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think, CKLA in particular is just so packed with lots of information and content. And I think, so CKLA is structured to bring back the important concepts and the important vocabulary down the road later in the year and for other grade levels. So that's helpful. But even other curricula that focus on content that are not as tightly structured, teachers have told me the kids remember certain things do stick. Kids are like sponges, but there are things that you can do to home in on. I think you have to understand when you're teaching one of these lessons or one of these units, what is the information and what is the vocabulary that you really want to have stick. And then you focus class discussion on that, focus like on those particular words, and also have kids use those words in their writing and those concepts in their writing. Because no, they're not, you know, the idea is not that they're going to remember every single fact that's covered. That's impossible. But some of it will stick. And what is most likely to stick is the information that kids get a chance to discuss and they get a chance to write about.
Yeah, that's awesome. It makes me think of Isabel Beck's work around kind of her tier 1, 2, and 3 words, that it's maybe not necessarily the domain vocabulary and that vocabulary that we're trying to teach them, but the knowledge itself gives them access to all of that really rich, as you said, academic vocabulary that they can apply across a lot of content and domains. So
Yes.
That's a really, really good to think about.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think that does it for our questions. And just for our audience out there, thanks for joining and taking some time out of your day to be with us. Natalie is actually going to join us again next Wednesday, same time. And she's going to dive deeper into the writing revolution. So if when she talked about writing, that kind of piqued your interest, I put a link in the chat to go register for that webinar next Wednesday. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, just be sure to look for an email tomorrow. It has your link to the recording, but also a link to a special website where you who came here live get to go select a book of your choice from Natalie, either The Knowledge Gap or The Writing Revolution. So that should hit your inbox tomorrow. Thank you so much, Natalie. We appreciated everything you shared today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
All right. Bye, everybody. Have a great evening.